Okay, waiting on YouTube. Yes. Okay, we're live. Great. That's awesome. All right. So yesterday we talked about Ezekiel, signs, and the nature of reality. But the conversation yesterday went in a certain direction where we ended up talking about the kingdom of heaven and the gospel. So I want to continue the conversation about what is what is the kingdom of heaven, and what is the kingdom of heaven? How does the concept of the kingdom of heaven get informed by the book of Ezekiel, and how does that kind of dovetail and work with the gospel? Okay, so just going to reiterate. I'll ask you, Emily, you can say hi.
Hi.
Yeah, you're heard, but not seen. All right. Ezekiel in of heaven. Kingdom of heaven. What does the kingdom of heaven mean? What is the concept of the kingdom of heaven? How would the kingdom of... Tom, what's up, bro? Tom's in there. What's the kingdom of heaven? What's that concept? You've heard the phrase in the Gospels. It's all over the place. The kingdom of heaven is among you. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has arrived. This kind of language. What is the kingdom of heaven? What's that? Where does that concept come from?
It's like a realm of inhabitants.
Okay, it's a realm that's of inhabitants, an inhabited realm, heaven. Is that what you're talking about? Okay. How does the phrase kingdom work into that?
That there is a throne on which Yahweh sits.
Okay, yeah. So part of the idea is there is a throne. You don't have a kingdom without a king. Most people, I've not heard a lot of people take hold of, I want to be more specific. I've not heard a lot of Christians take hold of the idea of the kingdom of heaven. Okay? They'll read it in their New Testament. They read it in their Gospels. And yeah, what's up, Tom? They read the kingdom of heaven in their Gospels, but it doesn't really mean anything to them theologically. One of the ways you can see this is, and praise God that we are easily exposed. One of the ways you know that we don't understand concepts in the Gospels is they don't enter into our worship at all. They don't enter into our prayer. They don't enter, and another way to say these kinds of things is they don't enter into our devotional life, where we express our devotion to Yeshua. The phrases never make their way into our devotional life. Now, I suspect there are some concepts that don't make their way into our devotional life precisely because we do understand them, and we're hypocrites. But I think an example might be hate your father, hate your mother, leave your, this kind of like, they can't love any of these more than me. I think we understand.
Write a song about that?
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of people understand it, but they don't like writing a song about it. There's a song I like. There is a song I actually love to worship to. And in the song, it's by John Lucas or something. But in the song, at the end, the bridge is, he says, "Away from me, I never knew you," and he repeats it over and over again. I love that song because there's something raw about it. There's a truth that I don't want to neglect. I don't want to leave behind. But sometimes we avoid, I think most times we avoid language we don't understand, and that's one of the reasons we don't carry it away into our worship. If we understood it, it'd be easier for us to carry it into worship. So I want to equip people to be able to express devotion to Yeshua in regards to the kingdom of heaven. So, kingdom of heaven. I've heard people try to define this as where God is ruling. Okay, God's rule. I've heard that people try to explain the kingdom of heaven as God's rule. How does that work? That wouldn't seem to work because is God not the ruler? Is God not in control? Is there a time where God isn't the one that the buck stops with? This kind of idea. And when I hear Christians try to define it that way, it becomes a problem with some of Yeshua's time-oriented claims about the kingdom, like temporal claims. He said the kingdom of heaven arrived. You now have to act a certain way. You have to perform an action, which is repent and believe in the gospel that the kingdom of heaven has arrived. Okay, which means prior to it arriving, the actions aren't as fitting. Something happened. So the question would be, how would Jesus' audience have heard him? That's really what I want to ask. How would Yeshua's audience have heard him when he says the kingdom of heaven is among you? And I think Ezekiel can help us.
Why is the temporal thing important?
Because it reveals that it reveals that an action, a punctiliar event, an event has happened or is happening. And if an event is taking place wherein the event is being described as the kingdom of heaven reigning, then prior to the event, what was the status of the kingdom of heaven? Where was it? If it's not there, then it couldn't just be it couldn't abstractly be God as a ruler, God's rulership, God being in control, God being in charge. I'm kind of
Oh, right. Because
Yeah.
Never a time that he's not in control. There just might be a time that he's not.
Exactly. I should be clear that this is how a lot of Christians try to make sense of it. Just God in control. The kingdom of heaven is God's rulership. But it's not that. It's not simply that. That's insufficient to explain what the kingdom of heaven is. So we have to look at we're going to look at some of the concepts about the kingdom of heaven. And we talked a little bit yesterday about the worst thing that the biggest tragedy and trauma in the Tanakh takes place in Ezekiel 9-11. Yahweh leaves. Yahweh leaves the people. He leaves the temple specifically. He leaves the throne. And the kingdom of heaven arriving, okay, and the New Testament, the kingdom of heaven arriving is called something else. It's called the gospel, the good news, okay? The gospel, the good news. In other places, it's literally called the gospel of the kingdom, okay? In Acts 20, 17-38, Paul will describe his apostling among the Ephesians, and Paul will say, he went about proclaiming the kingdom. Proclaiming the kingdom. So, this is what Yeshua did. He proclaimed the kingdom. He went about spreading the gospel of the kingdom. At the heart of the gospel is a message about a kingdom. And specifically, it's about a kingdom arriving, a kingdom coming near, a kingdom returning. Okay? So a core word, that's actually helpful. A core word for this notion of kingdom that Ezekiel is going to explore is the idea of a return.
Do they use the words arrive and return interchangeably?
They use the idea of appearing as well. Appearing, arrival, and return. Those would all be together. So before you can have the word appear or return or arrive, someone has to leave or not be there, at the very least, just not be there. So in Ezekiel, the idea of Ezekiel is this. Yahweh he brings Ezekiel in 8 and he says, I'm going to take you to the temple, show you the terrible things they're doing. And then in 9-11, there's a sequence of events where Yahweh begins to leave the temple, leaves his throne in the temple, which is the ark. Okay, so he's leaving the Holy of Holies, he's going out into the courtyard, he's leaving the threshold, he's going away from the temple. That is the bad news of the kingdom. Okay? The bad news of the kingdom. Of the kingdom. Which is actually really funny because this will show you something about Yahweh. Yahweh meant what he said when he told Samuel, I'm their king. So the judge, the shofet Samuel, Yahweh says to Samuel, when Samuel's a bit kind of dejected when they ask for a king, Yahweh says, they're not rejecting you as a judge, Samuel. They're rejecting me as a king because I'm their king. When Israel asks for a king. Yahweh is not the first king to have left. Actually, we have this picture where you have, Israel, Judah. And Samaria, there's the king, and then there will be a king there with the king in the temple. Israel's carted off. Judah's king gets carted off. Yahweh's still there in the temple, but their behavior continues to devolve. They continue to be committed to wickedness. And hey, what's up, Stacy? So they continue to be devoted to idolatry and destruction. And the last king to leave is the truest king of all. The last king to leave is really the only king, which is Yahweh. And he leaves. So the bad news of the kingdom has been unfolding. And the last one to leave was Yahweh. There's a lot to learn from that. But Yahweh leaves the temple. It creates this massive vacuum. Okay? And in that sense, heaven left earth. Because where heaven and earth join, heaven and earth are two realms. So first off, we can break down the idea of the kingdom of heaven. We can say that heaven, the word heaven, is alluding to the fact that there is at the very least, there is an unseen realm that exists alongside our realm. Okay? The two are not divorced because the place that they are joined is at the temple. The place that they were joined in the Torah in the beginning was Eden, which is why the restoration of Eden started with the tabernacle after Exodus, and it continues with this grand narrative of building a temple. And so in the whole...
When Adam and Eve left Eden, when they were kicked out of Eden, did then the kingdom of heaven move out of Eden?
To a degree, there was a way that, well, first off...
Because then they were allotted kingdoms, right?
Well, no, not in that order. It happened, there was a lot more of a breakdown there. And it's actually complicated because access, for the Israelites, access has always been graded according to election. There have always been higher levels of access and lower levels of access. The highest level of access would be the high priest. And Adam, humans, they had this unprecedented access prior to the fall. Now, trying to lay out literal events and how they unfolded in Genesis, trying to literally lay out how the events correlate to loss of access is a longer story. It's complicated.
Is that in the pattern of the temple too?
What?
The loss of access to Eden?
You would say that the pattern being broken is that. Yeah, absolutely. So that they go, yeah. So I'll say this, that heaven as a realm is a place that interlocks with the earth at the temple. The place of joining is the temple. So when we say that the kingdom of heaven is here, what we mean is the throne in the temple is occupied. Yahweh has actually joined us. This is the fulfillment of the great Abrahamic promise. I will be your God and you will be my people. We actually have to stop for a second and think. We have to force ourselves to think about this like the ancients. We have to force ourselves to hear this the way that the Torah is using it. We don't get to do this weird Christian thing where we say, well, God is the God of all anyways. Then God should not have made a promise. I will be your God. God should have said, I am already your God. Okay? And you could be my people because I'm everyone's God. That's not what he says. I will be your God and you will be my people. And so what's the distinction there? When he says, I will be your God, he does not mean, hey, what's up, Shante? When he says, I will be your God, he does not mean, I will be the person that is the source of your creation and the one who... That's already true. That's already true. That's not what they have in view. When he says, I will be your God and you'll be my people, literally, the thing he meant was, I will come into your presence in your midst and you'll be with me. I will dwell with you. The claim, I will be your God and you'll be my people, it hinges on local access to God. God actually stepping down and joining himself to us locally, a local joining, which is partly why Moses gets this. Moshe says this. He says, the thing that sets us apart from all the other nations, whoever has had a nation where God is in their midst. Okay? And one way to say this is, Abraham's people, okay, have had a series of bad news and good news. Okay? The bad news of slavery, okay, is overturned. The bad news of slavery is overturned with the good news of the arrival of kingdom. Moses and Aaron, backed by the power of Yahweh, stepping into Egypt, performing signs and wonders and beginning to break the the stronghold of slavery, and then escaping slavery. All these events, the unfolding events, this is the good news. Basically, from the burning bush through the getting out the other side on the Red Sea. The events, you could call that the good news for them, okay? Yay, okay. But it doesn't really, the purpose of the good news was to create space for there to be the setup of the tabernacle and the arrangement, this kind of idea, okay? It's the idea that God would actually stay. So one of the weirdest things of the Exodus is, if you actually go through the Torah, the narrative kind of looks like this. In Eden, Yahweh's there. He's just locally accessible. He still will come down from Shemay Shemayim. But throughout the Torah, there's this idea, Yahweh comes down, Yahweh goes up. Yahweh comes down, Yahweh goes up. Yahweh comes down, it's Yahweh Allah in Hebrew over and over again. He comes down, he goes up. He comes down, he goes up. He does something like, he comes down in Exodus 2, and it's kind of unclear as to whether he leaves. He seems to go up to a degree, but we know this for certain. He comes down and arrives locally during Passover, and he doesn't leave. After the Passover, he doesn't leave. What we can demonstrate confidently with the narrative is, once he comes down for the Passover, he doesn't leave his people again. Like, he doesn't. So the rationale of the tabernacle is God has come down to be among us. He's rescued us from Egypt, and he's come down to be in our midst. And now he saved us. And in light of that salvation, he is now building a home to be with us locally, to begin fulfilling the promise, I'll be your God, you'll be my people. Okay. And we're going to transition to make that permanent. Right now we're nomadic. And we've got this long process ahead of us where I will be localized among you, and you will take control of this land that's my land. Okay, this is where we end up in Ezekiel. Okay. Heaven is joined to earth at the throne, which is the ark. The ark of the covenant in the Holy of Holies is the throne. It is the joining of heaven and earth. Heaven, to say that the kingdom of heaven is among us for Israelites, is to say that the ark is inhabited and Yahweh sits on the ark. Tom asked a question. Before the temple was built, was the ark or Holy of Holies the only joining source of heaven and earth? That's a great question, Tom. I would say it seems like ultimately no, that there were other points where God would, basically any time that Yahweh shows up, you could say that it's something like heaven and earth coming together. And actually, Tom, to help you a little bit, this is related to the question of why did they use high places when they worshiped? They thought of, again, their conception of heaven and earth. There's a solid dome, the rakia. If I get on a high place, I'm closer to that dome, which past that dome is this unseen realm, the Shemay Shemayim. And so I get on this high place and I address God. And there are multiple places where God is willing to meet. But God's heart and God's desire is that the truest place of joining, God's intention, God's pattern and plan, is that there be oneness, a singular place where heaven and earth join. The first place was Eden. There would be a singular place of joining. And from that singular place, Eden would spread over the earth. That would be God's intention. Which is why, Tom, if you'll go, Moshe says in Deuteronomy 12, look, you're doing it this way where everyone's going on the high places as they choose. But there will come a day where I choose a place for my name to dwell. When I elect a place for my name to dwell, you will go and you will build a place and you will all come to that one place, which is the truest form of restoration of Eden. And that's repeated again in 1 Kings chapter 3, where Shlomo, Solomon, he goes to a high place in Gibeon. And a lot of people are going to different high places. But the ultimate aim of Yahweh will be one singular place. So it's a good question, Tom. And it helps us because that is his intention. And that intention is going to be expressed in Yeshua. But heaven and earth are joined there. Ezekiel basically tells us what happens when heaven leaves earth. When God abandons the throne. If the good news is a reoccupied throne, the bad news is an unoccupied throne, an empty throne. That's the bad news. Now, I mentioned this a little bit yesterday, but this is good to touch on now. The bad news is there's more than just one unoccupied throne. There are unoccupied thrones. Okay? There are unoccupied thrones. David's throne. Okay? You're going to have problems with the high priesthood. Okay? And the ark. All of these are unoccupied. All of these are unoccupied thrones. That's the bad news. Heaven and earth are divorced. Earth is without the benefit of Yahweh's kind, loving, gracious steering and rulership. This joining of heaven and earth is the conduit by which Eden begins to form around Yahweh and spreads outward. If we break this connection, we ensure a curse and death. We ensure death. This explains a lot of what they mean by life and death. They don't think of these as biological processes. They tend to think about this like not thinking about it like biological processes. They tend to think about this as a functional result of proximity to Yahweh. So that Yahweh himself is the life. Death is separation from him because for them, life is synonymous with proper function, right function. Life is orderly, loving, right function. This is partly why you would say when Yahweh creates things and orders them and gives them their function, he'll repeat a refrain. And Yahweh saw that it was good. It was Tov. And Yahweh called it good. And Yahweh said it's good. Well, the question would then be, if it is good, what's the source of the goodness? The orderer. Which is why in Hebrew, Tuvacha, your goodness, Yahweh's goodness, it's a shorthand way to refer to Yahweh's localized presence and all the benefits that it brings. So when Moshe says, show me your glory, I want to see you, in Exodus 33, Yahweh says, I'll cause my face to pass before you. He says, I'll cause all my goodness to pass over you, which literally means his localized presence. And we know the results of that. The results of that is Moshe tries to go back to the camp and he looks like an alien. That's the result of receiving God's goodness. Amen. Like you're not the same. It transforms you, and it transforms you into his likeness. So if we break that connection point between heaven and earth, it is inevitable. Inevitably, it is death, which is why death is a spatial concept. Death is a spatial concept in the Torah.
Places or dead lands
or proximity and access. Proximity, access, and location. That's how we understand death. And I'll give an example. Literally in Genesis 2, so clear. This is so funny. If people have it, regardless, I don't have an interest in delving into the creation evolution thing right now. People lose their minds about it. But even if you land on the side of having a literal reading of the Torah, you can run into a problem with the word yom or days. This is often at the center of the creation evolution debate, is the word day. Well, a problem with that is in Genesis 2, okay, Yahweh says, don't eat from the tree that's in the center of the garden to Adam. For in the day you eat of it, you will surely die. In Hebrew, it's intensified with you'll die. You'll die. The verb is conjugated twice to just be like, there's no confusion here. But in the day you eat of it, you'll die. If death is a biological, material, ontological process, they didn't die. Okay? They didn't die that day. But if death is actually a functional geographical concept, meaning location, access, and proximity, they did die that day. Because they were thrust, their location changed, they lost access, and their proximity was diminished. That's death. That's death. And so if we're not joined to Yahweh, anything not joined to Yahweh, the law of death takes over. Like it's a principle, like it dies. He is the source of life. it returns back to the dust. Dust is representative of formlessness, chaos. There is no distinction. There's no order, which is partly, it's an interesting thing to say that man is made out of dust. Okay. Kudos to Yahweh for making anything out of dust. And they know that. They don't mean another word, afar. They have words like Adam and Adamah, like from the ground, this kind of thing. They have words for clay. They differentiate from other ancient Near Eastern kind of depictions, creation mythos or creation stories, that Yahweh used afar, which is dust. Okay, there's a saying in English about a useless endeavor activities: catch a fart and paint it yellow. Well, it seems Yahweh did it because I'm here talking to you, right? Like that. But also, it's an interesting thing to say he formed man out of the dust, because can you give credit? Can you give credit to the dust? Could it be an accident? Could it just be this? Again, I'm not talking about mechanism here. I'm talking about authorship and teleology.
It spontaneously create itself.
That's the mechanism. That's what I'm not talking about. That's mechanism. I'm not talking about that. That's mechanism. I am talking about authorship and teleology. Could it give itself its own purpose? No. Could it have its own purpose by itself? It is literally just take one of the most purposeless things, okay, dust, and give it purpose. God's the source of it. Everything has its purpose and its life and its right function and its order from Yahweh. He's the source of its goodness. If we reject Yahweh and we cut ourselves off from him, death begins to take place. From dust you come, to the dust you will return. So we can pick back up with this idea of heaven being broken, a throne being abandoned. Okay, this entire restoration of Eden appears to be broken. It's done. Yahweh leaves, and he doesn't return. There's nowhere in the Tanakh that Yahweh returns. He leaves in Ezekiel, and he does not return. Actually, the rest of the minor prophets, and I say minor prophets, it's kind of a false distinction, but it's a distinction that has more to do with where in history they prophesy than it does to do with how big of a deal are they. That's how people hear minor prophets. They think they're just not as big of a deal as, an Isaiah or something. That's not what it means. Minor prophets, I'll say it this way. When I say minor prophets, I tend to mean the prophets that are post-exilic. Post-Israel being thrust out, post-Judah being thrust out, and definitely post-Yahweh leaving. And we've got Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Okay, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi are three really big ones for the post-exilic prophets. All of them are in this. These are prophets, too, that are pretty closely historically associated with Judeans returning from exile to start trying to rebuild the temple after it's destroyed. Okay? Yahweh never fills it. What's even weird is the temple complex itself isn't ever really completed. It gets close, and it definitely gets to it achieves functional order, within a couple hundred years of the return, but it's never completed. Okay, and then it gets defiled by Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid king, the Greek king, and it gets restored by the Maccabeans, but it doesn't get completed, like all of it put back in working order and this kind of thing, until Herod. And wouldn't you know, lo and behold, right around that time, soon around that time is when this Yeshua shows up. Like, it's the right time. It's the right time. This idea of the throne, the idea that the Messiah would come and there would be, it's an interesting thing that the Messiah would come and there be no standing temples is ridiculous, according to the prophets. And so you have this window of opportunity that Yeshua arrives at. And this issue of the kingdom of heaven arriving is very ambiguous, which is why Yeshua used Psalm 100. I'll repeat that again. Which throne was Yeshua saying was going to be occupied with this arrival? Which kingdom was arriving? And I mean the priesthood is part of this, because there are confusing prophecies Psalm 110 is an example of this. But there are confusing prophecies in the minor prophets, in Zechariah 6, in Zechariah 14, in the weird ecstatic vision of 2 olive trees or 2 lampstands, which each represent a Messiah. Okay, 2 Messiahs, 2 Mashiachs. By the way, both of these guys, David and they're both Mashiachs, they're anointed ones. Okay, anointed ones. So when you have a guy named Yeshua and people asking, is he the Christ? They don't mean that's a Greek. Is he the Mashiach? Is he Mashiach? Is he the anointed one? You could have the debate, well, which anointed one and what's his function? But what you could never ask is, well, it has nothing to do with the kingdom. It has everything to do with the kingdom. It has everything to do with the throne. So this term, the kingdom of heaven, it's sad that it's so far removed from the typical Christian's life and their devotional life, because it's absolutely the center of the gospel. It's absolutely at the center of what it means to follow Yeshua, and it's at the center of what Yeshua came to accomplish. So it means if you don't understand this, you likely don't understand Yeshua's ministry. And if you don't understand his ministry, you very likely don't understand him. And there are all kinds of reasons as to why you don't understand him. Maybe you have a fake version of Yeshua, fake version of Jesus or something that you think that you've been taught about, whatever. Or you have some kind of impoverished version. So even if you've made contact with the real Yeshua, with Jesus, you are being told, this is how you should understand the contact that you've had with Jesus by people, giving you theology and different teachings, whatever. But this test would be, how is it that I know, how is it that this phrase the Messiah constantly uses has fallen out of usage among his followers? It's a weird question. But it's at the center of almost everything he says. Like, it's at the center of all his parables. It's at the center of his whole life. He is the onus that's on him, the purpose of his life, the vocational purpose of fulfilling it, has to do with accomplishing this, the kingdom of heaven. So we can get to your word return.
What's the high priesthood leaving the throne?
What's it's leaving the throne?
Yeah,
well, there are historical problems.
The ark is actually Yahweh leaving, right?
Yeah.
David's throne is David.
He's kicked out, right?
Yeah.
So the priesthood?
Yeah.
Well, the priesthood suffers and goes through different problems. This is actually why we have this weird little Jewish group called the Essenes in Yeshua's day. They think that the high priesthood should be occupied by the high priesthood that David put in place, the line of Zadok, because that's not what happens. Basically, they start playing games, the Maccabees. Once the Maccabees rule, the Maccabees don't have a right to the throne or the priesthood. But because they restored the temple and God's with them, obviously he's helping them, their children, they begin to go through a generational series of infighting and political stealing of power, and they start giving their own children the priesthood. And this kind of they're not sons of Aaron. It's just a real it's so this the scenes where people who said we can't be a part of, because the temple is not restored just because you get rid of blood and you get rid of physical, you put the right physical objects in. They would argue, they would probably argue something like, go read Exodus. One of the vessels that you have not properly installed in the temple order is the priesthood. So if you have every other object in place, but you don't have the right priesthood, you don't have a functioning temple, which is partly why we run into this issue that this is central to the gospel and central to our proclamation of the gospel. Rabbi, what's up, man? This should be a central tenet. Nobody claimed that the glory reoccupied the temple. What? During Yeshua's life. Any time from the time of the Judean return, under the order of Cyrus, 70 years after exile, up until the time of Yeshua, no one claimed that the glory returned to that Temple Mount, to Zion. In fact, Zechariah prophesied in chapter 1 that it would happen. The last chapters of the last book in the Tanakh, in Malachi, prophesied that the glory would return to the temple. Haggai says in chapter 2, he prophesies the glory will return. There's this latent expectation, this hope. It's not yet happened. During the time of the Maccabees, no one claimed that the glory did return. They ran into all kinds of issues, and the Pharisees would have had a lot of fights and issues with the Sadducees about who should be the priests and how the priesthood should function. And it could still be argued that the temple was never brought to the place of being restored so that the glory would return. Go back to your Torah. The last stage, the last step, is once you have all the items according to the pattern that was shown to Moses on the mountain installed, then the glory enters. They couldn't get their act together. Right? It's the opposite of what you see in Exodus. In Exodus, at least, there is a unity of spirit, a voluntary offering called the terumah, where every person brings their little piece in contribution, their gold, their silver, whatever, and it gets piled up. And that terumah is used to construct the tabernacle. And it does construct the priests too, because the priests have to be anointed, they have to have the right garments, the vesture, all this kind of stuff. And God aids them with enough unity of mind to go about the process of building the tabernacle. Post-return, they can't unify themselves to build the temple. This is bad news stacked on top of bad news stacked on top of bad news. Yeshua's arrival, it goes straight into the heart. It goes straight into the heart of these issues. So when Messiah arrives on the scene, he is tackling the question of priesthood, David's throne, and this one is the most bizarre. He's tackling the issue of Yahweh's enthroned presence. And he does it with he's a very, very tricky. He's purposefully tricky. Go back and read how deep the Messiah was thinking about these things and talking about these things in the Gospels. You will be shocked. Go to where the Pharisees charge Yeshua, your disciples are violating Shabbat by eating heads of grain. Okay, they're defiling Shabbat. First off, they're not defiling Shabbat according to Moshe. Okay, they're not defiling Shabbat according to Moshe. They're defiling Shabbat according to the traditions of the fathers. Yeshua has already shown where he stands with the traditions of the fathers. He has no interest in them. Okay, this idea of washing hands before you eat, traditions of the fathers. And he actually cites some of their traditions when he criticizes them about korban, taking care of, like setting aside their funds that are be devoted to Yahweh, but they don't take care of their elderly. And thus they put down the command of Moses, honor your father and mother in order to keep their tradition. So they accuse him on the lines of tradition, which is it's a political move. It's not just politics in the way that we think of it. They're trying to see where he stands. Yeshua has the most in common theologically with the Pharisees, which is why his conversations, he has more conversations with them than anyone else. And actually, I would argue it's why his rebuke of them is the sharpest. He invests the most emotional energy with the Pharisees. He invests almost no energy whatsoever with the Sadducees. He will literally say to them when they try to trick him about marriage, you don't know the scriptures or the power of God. Okay? But he'll say to the Pharisees, you go right up to the gate of the kingdom of heaven. You yourself don't enter and you forbid others from entering. Okay? He would probably say to the Sadducees, if he used that same metaphor, you're not even in the right continent. Okay? So you're not only you're not up to the gate, you're nowhere to be, get out of here. Okay? And he says, literally, all of these things get touched on when he talks to them. They say to him, he says, do the priests violate Shabbat when they do work? Okay, he sidesteps their question. But it's a weird question because who are these people? But I thought we were talking about these disciples from Bethany and places in Nazareth. How are they priests? If they're priests, what God are they serving? And then he says, something greater than the temple is here. It's a bizarre claim. Not only that, he tells them this really historical reading. Yeshua knows the scriptures really well. He knows the scriptures radically well. Yeshua knows the ancient scriptures radically well, and he uses it to his advantage. You actually ought to go and read through the Old Testament just to gain a further appreciation for how well your Messiah schooled people who ask him questions. Because he will say to them, let me tell you about this obscure story in Samuel about David going to the priest who was at Nob. And he got bread of presents that was only lawful for priests to eat. Now he's setting up a problem for them. It's a conundrum, but he's also accusing them. If you read your Tanakh, you'll understand that there are people who are watching David do this. Okay? There's a person in that story that watches David does this. goes back and has priests killed. He's not an Israelite. He's Doeg the Edomite. Doeg the Edomite was a follower of Shaul, and he was there, and he's partaking, and he's watching, and he goes and carries back word. And that priest, I think it's Achimelech, I can't remember his name, but that priest ends up being slaughtered. And the priests of Nob end up being slaughtered because this person who pretends to be loyal to a king, which is Saul, who's not the rightful king, but it's actually not even among Israel, is a hypocrite and a destroyer of the people of Israel. So if you read between the lines, Yeshua is talking to the Pharisees. He's recasting that story. What's ambiguous is Yeshua saying he's David, taking the bread, and his disciples are with his friends, taking from the bread of presence? Is Yeshua saying his followers are like David, and something else is the presence? It gets deeper. Why is the tabernacle at Nob? If you go and read your Tanakh further, the throne is not at the tabernacle at Nob. Because after the time of Eli, the tabernacle complex, the tent, was separated from the ark and some of its vestments. So even further, he's talking about a time where we don't have the throne united with sacred space. He has so many things he's putting out there. To say that he was speaking in parables is an understatement. It's an understatement. It's like everything that. And if you are, it's a Chinese finger trap, everything that comes out of his mouth. The question is, the good news of the kingdom, how far does Yeshua's good news go? Which throne does he occupy? The people listening to him, if they thought the kingdom returning, well, let's first off, just to prove my point, they were thinking primarily of the Davidic kingdom. They heard the term Mashiach, or anointed one. They would probably bandy about maybe a priest and maybe a king, a priest king, that's prophesied in the minor prophets. So probably it's either two messiahs or one messiah fulfilling both offices. Okay? That would be about what they thought. This explains why the disciples in chapter, it's after the resurrection, after 40 days of Yeshua appearing to them and giving them signs and all this kind of stuff. They're like, will he now restore the kingdom to Israel? In Acts. That's how your book of Acts starts. People love the book of Acts, but it actually has quite a depressing start because his followers still don't really get it, which is not too depressing because what makes them really get it? Oh, it was a really good lesson Jesus gave before he went to heaven. No. What makes them get it? Oh, they went back and studied their Bibles. No. Acts 2 makes them get it. They receive the Holy Spirit. And through the reception of the Holy Spirit, they receive this dramatic power and understanding. To such a degree, for example, fast forward a couple chapters, and the Sanhedrin, who was the creme de la creme of Torah scholars, are a bit set back by how well Peter and John are answering them, knowing that they're fishermen. And Peter cuts at the jugular in that encounter because he says, we have received, what you're seeing is the work of the Holy Spirit, the gift that God gives to those who obey him, and you do not obey him, so you do not have it. And so very, very strong language. They never dreamed that they could dream that Yeshua would fulfill, could occupy these two roles. They could dream of that he would occupy David's throne, and he would occupy some kind of high priestly role. They could get behind that. Okay? What they could never have dreamed of was that he was occupying all of the thrones. All of the thrones. Reoccupying is a better way to say that he is reoccupying all of the thrones. All right? Which is why the good news should be synonymous with a return, but another way to say it, the good news should be synonymous with a reoccupation, a re-enthronement. The bad news is an empty throne, and the good news must be a fulfilled throne, a reoccupied throne. This is at the heart of the gospel. But what is mind-boggling is the throne that he occupies first is the greatest throne. So it's like he's going in reverse order. Okay, the throne that he occupies first is the ark in the heaven of heavens, like the right hand of God, the right hand of El Elyon, God Most High. He sits next to him, which that itself is theological language. We as Westerners, we have all this silly stuff. I don't want to be too I am very pejorative about it. I'm very negative about it. But we have a lot of ideas about God that are completely foreign to Scripture and very foreign to the people who received the covenants. If I'm going to use Pauline language, Paul says, "Hey, it's the Jews who received the covenants, and theirs is the temple service, okay, and theirs is the glory." This kind of stuff. Well, we as Westerners have adopted a lot of ways of talking about God that have nothing to do with that. That would be completely foreign, and so I'm suspicious that it's a jacked enterprise. We think someone claiming to be God, it would require them talking about their ontos, like their material ontos. What are you made out of? What do you mean that you're God? Okay, this kind of thing. They have a functional ontology, and so what's one of the easiest ways to claim that he is God? Well, it's that he adopts the posture of sitting. No one sits by God. God sits. Everyone else stands and attends to him. But the fact that he says, "I will sit," and he uses Psalm 110, it is itself it is an ontological claim. It's a claim that I am God. Not some weird Greek ousis, homoousis, made of the same substance. Okay, that's not what he's talking about. He is saying, whatever function you attribute to El Elyon is my function. Which is crazy. This is part, like, that is why they tore their robes, because he gave away his cipher. So he speaks in parables, but he has a cipher. Okay, and some of an idea he likes to go back and forth with is he likes to use Psalm 110, but he never really gives his cipher in public. He actually uses Psalm 110 during the Passion Week to silence the Pharisees, which is a really big task, but he does it. And the way he silences them is he says, Psalm 110. All right, Kemma. In Psalm 110. Or David, or actually he says it this way. Who is the Messiah the son of? Is what he asks. Who is the Messiah the son of? They say, "Oh, David." He says, why then does David call him Lord? And he quotes the first verse. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. That's impossible for them hierarchically. The idea that he's the son of David, but David calls him Lord. This is an added problem. He's being extra cryptic because at this time the word Lord, Mar in Aramaic, Adonai in Hebrew, Kyrios in Greek, it evolved post-exile among Jewish communities. This became a proper noun as a replacement for the word Yahweh or Yehovah, however they pronounced it, okay? God's name. It became a filler for it. Okay, this is similar to a positive, well, it might be negative too, but a positive version of he who must not be named in Harry Potter is Voldemort. Okay, when we say he who must not be named, we don't mean, well, it's talking about a third person masculine male that we're not supposed to name and that anybody could fit that bill. It's Voldemort. What do you do? Like, right? That's why they're doing it. Okay, when they use Lord this way, it's a fill-in. He uses that ambiguity in that chapter, but he doesn't give a cipher. He doesn't give the secret to understand how he's exegeting it. He just trips them up with it, and they say, "We don't know why." He says, "Okay, I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you either. Or I'm not going to respond to you either." Okay, and he silences them. Okay. But he gives it away in front of Caiaphas because he uses verse 6, 5 or 6. I think it's 5. He uses Psalm 110 verse 5, but he gives away his cipher because he couples it with Daniel 7:13. And he explains what he thought at the right hand meant. And it meant being the cloud rider who's in the appearance of the Son of Man, who goes up to the Ancient of Days and receives worship, this kind of thing. Which, at that point, you could imagine that that it resolves the issue if we can't find the witnesses and all this kind of stuff. And the only witnesses we can find, they're still kind of contradictory, is he said he destroyed the temple. We know the temple's at the center of this. But we now no longer need testimony, and we tear my robes because he said this. He quoted this about himself. But another way to say this is they understood that he was saying, this is my throne. If you are a king, where is your throne? It's like saying, if you were the Messiah, where's your destiny? Well, which Messiah? How does this work? It gets, there's even added confusion because we say, well, the ark's not a Messiah. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Because the entire tabernacle complex before it can be occupied and used, it has to be anointed with oil. Okay, all of it. Not only that, the stone that Yaakov lays his head on and then has the vision of God and says, this will be Beitel, the house of God. He mashachs it, he anoints it. Stone, a cornerstone, the first stone, which is like, so, and what does Yeshua say about himself in John? I tell you the truth, you'll see the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Okay, which is, he's the house of God. So the question of what throne does Yeshua get, or what throne is he claiming to have access to, is at the heart of the gospel. And it's also why the gospel is was so dangerous politically. That's why the gospel is so dangerous historically. If you had a gospel of Thomas, which was it postdates the canonical gospel by at least a century. Okay, if you had a gospel of Thomas, Caesar's not gonna kill you. If you have a gospel of Thomas, if you have a gospel of Matthew, Caesar will kill you. Wait, why? Because one takes Yeshua and puts him into the caste of a spiritual guru within Western metaphysics and the idea of a kind of escaping materialism and Gnosticism, this kind of thing. It really doesn't affect this world, because this world is going to hell and it needs to be destroyed, whatever. The difference between that and, nope, he's actually a Jewish king and he's going to fill the valley with your corpses. Psalm 110 verse 6, he will fill the valley with corpses. So Isaiah 66, he will go to war with all these people and their decaying corpses will be like, he is an actual king. Okay, so when the four gospels we have force you to make a claim dyadically. You can't say with the four canonical gospels that Yeshua is Lord and Caesar is Lord. You have to pick. And Rome was definitely in the business of helping people pick the way they wanted them to pick. And Rome would help you pick Caesar. It had all kinds of ways to help you make that choice if you were struggling to wonder who was king, Yeshua or Caesar. Okay? All kinds of tools available at his disposal to make sure people went about making the choice that they had been making, which is Caesar is Lord. Caesar was already used to this with his empire, multiple little pocket kingdoms, saying that they had a king and had to squelch that. So he had a lot of tools at his disposal. The kingdom of heaven, the gospel is born as it is born within a really complicated political nexus of kingship. And this is the early faith had to deal with this question. You don't get to say, well, I'm an immature, weak believer. My brother Joe Ray was saying this to me yesterday. I'm reminded of it. You don't get to say, I'm a weak, immature believer. I can't worry about whether or not I'll lay my life down. If you decide to publicly proclaim Yeshua, you are publicly disavowing the claims that Caesar makes about himself throughout the empire. So like step one, okay, that's step one. Well, what changes? How does this change historically? Well, very simple. Kingdom. We then conflate the kingdom of earth with the kingdom of heaven. And that's what ends up happening. What ends up being called the way, or Christianity, becomes Christendom. The idea that it is an actual earthly principality that should be meted out. Unfortunately, exactly the opposite of what Yeshua says. Yeshua said, "You will not be." Yeshua appointed apostles as the highest hierarchical role in his kingdom in the church, and he says, "You will not do as the Gentiles do and lord it over them." And they found a spiritual reason to do exactly what the Gentiles do and lord it over people. So this idea of kingdom of heaven, a lot of stuff foundationally, but this is at the core of what Yeshua came to accomplish. I think we're at 54 minutes. Do you have questions or any kind of, you have some time, so space there.
I have to be really quick.
Okay, that's great. While you go, I will, as a side note for anyone listening, if you have any questions about some of the stuff that I've claimed or some of the stuff that I've talked about, please put it in the comments, either on the YouTube video or the Facebook video. Share the video, think about it. tell me what kinds of ideas or thoughts that the points that I'm making raise. Let me know if I've struck a nerve. Let me know if you disagree with what I'm saying. Any of these things would be, I think, would be edifying and fruitful. And I've also had the thought of trying to make smaller, snippet-like videos with tackling tinier issues than an hour-long video, just kind of meandering and going where the conversation leads us. I like these longer videos. I know that some people would enjoy them driving and doing their own thing. Maybe if they have more time to kill, but it's a little bit harder for people to get into with time commitment to have such a massive video. So I'm more than happy to make shorter snippets. So yeah. All right. Bless you guys. I think I'm going to go ahead and call it, and then we can do this again tomorrow, 12 p.m. or right after second watch. Bless you guys.